Look, I know what people are going to say about this whole situation, but honestly, I'm tired of pretending like I was the only one who screwed up here. My name's Ariana, I'm 32, and yeah, I had an affair. But there's way more to this story than just that simple fact, and maybe if you heard the whole thing, you'd understand why things went down the way they did. I'd been married to Xavier for 8 years, together for 12 total, basically half my adult life at that point. He's 34 and works in some supply chain thing that I never really understood, while I handle paperwork at a clinic. Nothing fancy, but we were doing okay financially. The thing is, Xavier used to be this completely different guy when we first met. Back in college, he was the type who dated around, never settled down, always had girls chasing after him. He was confident, spontaneous, the kind of guy who would show up at your door at midnight with takeout and a crazy story about his day. But somewhere along the way, after we got married, he turned into this completely different person. Like, overnight, he became this overly attentive husband who remembered every single anniversary, not just our wedding anniversary, but the anniversary of our first date, first kiss, first time we said I love you. He'd plan these elaborate surprise date nights that honestly felt more like performances than actual fun. Every morning, he'd bring me coffee in bed and ask about my dreams from the night before. Every evening, he'd want to know about every detail of my workday, down to what I had for lunch and who I talked to. At first, I thought it was sweet, but after a few years, it started feeling suffocating. Like I couldn't breathe without him wanting to analyze why I was breathing that way. He'd notice if I seemed even slightly off and would spend the entire evening trying to figure out what was wrong, even when nothing was wrong. I just wanted to exist without having to explain my every mood and thought to someone else. By March of last year, I was feeling completely trapped in this routine. Every Friday night was date night, always somewhere Xavier had researched extensively beforehand. Every Sunday morning was farmer's market, followed by meal prep for the week. Every evening was dinner together, then Netflix on the couch, where Xavier would want to cuddle and talk about whatever we were watching. It was like living the same week over and over again, just with different restaurants and different shows. That's when Michael started working with our sister location and began showing up to our monthly inter-office meetings. He was 29, funny in this sarcastic way that actually made me laugh instead of Xavier's dad jokes that I'd been forcing smiles at for years. Michael would make these observations about people that were spot on but not mean, just real. When our boss would drone on about new policies, Michael would catch my eye and make this subtle face that perfectly captured how ridiculous the whole thing was. After the meetings, a few of us would sometimes grab coffee, and Michael and I started having these conversations that felt actually engaging. He'd ask about my weekend, but when I'd say it was the usual routine, he'd push back and ask what I actually wanted to do instead. When I mentioned feeling like I was living in Groundhog Day, he totally got it. He was dealing with similar stuff in his own relationship. Everything planned out, no room for spontaneity, partners who thought being predictable meant being loving. These conversations were innocent at first, just two people venting about feeling stuck. But I started looking forward to those monthly meetings in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in months. Michael would text me funny memes between meetings, or send me articles about random topics we'd discussed. It felt normal to have a friend who didn't need constant updates about my emotional state or detailed explanations of my thoughts. The thing is, Xavier had female friends too, but he was always completely transparent about every interaction. He'd come home and be like, "Sarah from accounting invited me to lunch tomorrow. Is that cool? We're probably going to talk about the Peterson project." Meanwhile, I didn't feel like I needed to give Xavier a play-by-play of every conversation I had with Michael. That would just make Xavier paranoid for absolutely no reason, and honestly, I deserved to have some privacy in my life. I started keeping my phone on silent when Xavier was around, not because I was hiding anything serious, but because I didn't want to deal with his questions about who was texting me. Xavier would always want to know who was messaging and what they were saying, not in a controlling way, but in this overly interested way that felt exhausting. With Michael, I could just be myself, without having to explain or justify every reaction or thought. The more I talked to Michael, the more I realized how much Xavier had changed from the confident guy I'd fallen for. Somewhere along the line, he'd become this person who seemed to need constant reassurance that I was happy, that our relationship was solid, that he was doing everything right. Instead of just being present and confident, he was always checking in, always monitoring, always trying to optimize our relationship, like it was some kind of project he was managing. The emotional thing with Michael escalated pretty naturally once we started texting outside of work. It wasn't like I planned for it to happen. It just felt so normal to share actual thoughts with someone who listened without immediately trying to fix everything or turn it into a learning opportunity about our relationship. Michael would text me random observations throughout the day, funny things he noticed, articles he thought I'd find interesting. I'd respond when Xavier was in the shower or watching one of his sports games that he'd try to explain to me, even though I'd told him 1,000,000 times I didn't care about the rules. I was careful about the timing, obviously. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I knew Xavier would blow it out of proportion and turn a simple friendship into some kind of relationship crisis that we'd have to analyze to death. Xavier had this way of taking normal interactions and making them into these deep conversations about trust and communication that honestly just sucked all the fun out of everything. Michael started making these comments about how lucky Xavier was to have someone who actually got humor, who could have intelligent conversations about more than just work and weekend plans. He'd say things like how he wished he could find someone who understood him the way I seemed to understand Michael. These conversations made me feel appreciated in a way I hadn't felt in years. Like someone actually saw me as an interesting person, instead of just Xavier's wife, who needed constant check-ins and romantic gestures. Meanwhile, Xavier kept up his exhausting routine of bringing me coffee every morning and asking about my dreams, planning elaborate Friday night dates that felt more like job interviews than fun, and suggesting we try new restaurants or take weekend trips whenever I seemed even slightly less enthusiastic than usual. He completely missed the point that the problem wasn't our activities. The problem was how everything felt scheduled and performed instead of natural and spontaneous. The physical thing with Michael started during a work conference where both our offices sent people. I usually avoided these events because they were boring and took up entire weekends, but I volunteered to go this time. Michael was going too, and honestly, the idea of having someone interesting to talk to made the whole thing seem less tedious. After the day sessions, a bunch of us ended up at the hotel bar. Most people left pretty early, but Michael and I stayed talking until they basically kicked us out at closing time. We were discussing everything: our jobs, our relationships, what we actually wanted out of life instead of what we'd somehow ended up with. He told me about feeling trapped in his own routine, how his girlfriend planned out their entire lives without asking what he actually wanted, how he missed feeling excited about anything. I told him about Xavier's suffocating attention, how I felt like I was constantly being managed instead of loved, how I missed feeling like someone's choice instead of someone's obligation. Michael got it completely. He didn't try to give me advice or suggest couples therapy or tell me I should appreciate having someone who cared so much. He just listened and understood that sometimes caring can feel like being smothered if it's not the kind of caring you actually need. One thing led to another, and we ended up in my room. I'm not gonna lie, it felt incredible. Not just the physical part, but the emotional connection, the spontaneity, the feeling of being with someone who wanted to be there because they were genuinely attracted to me, not because they were fulfilling some husband duty checklist. Michael didn't need to plan or research or optimize the experience. It just happened naturally, passionately, the way things used to happen with Xavier before he turned romance into a scheduled maintenance program. The affair continued over the next 4 months, and honestly, it made me a better wife to Xavier in some ways. I was happier, less resentful, more patient with his constant need for reassurance and validation. I could appreciate his thoughtful gestures without feeling suffocated by them, because I was getting my real emotional needs met elsewhere. I even started initiating some romantic stuff with Xavier because I felt generous and satisfied in my own life. Xavier was thrilled with this development, of course. He thought his persistent romantic efforts were finally paying off, that I was finally learning to appreciate everything he did for me. He had no idea that I was only able to tolerate his suffocating attention because I had somewhere else to go for actual excitement and genuine connection. Michael and I would meet for long lunches, text throughout the day, and find excuses to see each other outside of work. The thrill of having this secret connection made everything else in my life more tolerable. I kept getting more confident about juggling everything, especially since Xavier seemed completely clueless. He actually started backing off a little with the constant questions and check-ins, which I took as a sign that he was finally learning to give me some breathing room. He'd stopped asking to see my phone when it buzzed, stopped wanting detailed reports about my lunch breaks, stopped planning surprise visits to my office. I thought he was finally growing up and learning that trust meant not needing to monitor everything I did. What I didn't realize was that Xavier had started getting suspicious around month 2 of my thing with Michael, and instead of confronting me like the old Xavier would have, he'd decided to get smart about it. While I thought I was outsmarting him, he was actually documenting everything. He'd installed some tracking app on our shared phone plan that let him see my location and text logs. He'd started taking pictures of my car's mileage and noting when I came home later than usual. He was basically building a case while I thought I was getting away with everything. The funny thing is, Xavier's new approach actually worked better for our relationship in the short term. Instead of being this needy guy who needed constant reassurance, he started acting more confident and detached. He'd make plans without asking for my input first. He'd suggest I take weekend trips with friends. He'd even encourage me to stay out later when I said I was having drinks with colleagues after work. I thought he was finally becoming the confident guy I'd married again. During this time, I was meeting Michael more frequently. We'd have these long lunches at restaurants across town where we knew we wouldn't run into anyone from either of our offices. Michael would drive separately, and we'd spend hours talking about everything: our childhoods, our dreams, what we'd do if we could start our lives over. He made me feel intellectually stimulated in a way Xavier never had. While Xavier wanted to talk about practical stuff like our budget and weekend plans, Michael and I would discuss philosophy, travel, what we thought about different movies and books. I started taking bigger risks, like meeting Michael at his apartment when his girlfriend was out of town, or having him pick me up from work occasionally. The excitement of almost getting caught made everything feel more intense and romantic. Meanwhile, Xavier was being more accommodating than ever, even suggesting that I needed more independence and encouraging me to pursue friendships outside of our marriage. Michael and I started talking more seriously about what we wanted from each other. He'd mention feeling guilty about his girlfriend, but then he'd say how he'd never connected with anyone the way he connected with me. We'd discuss what it would look like if we both left our relationships, but neither of us seemed ready to actually do it. The sneaking around had become part of the excitement, and honestly, having the security of our established relationships while getting the passion from each other felt like the best of both worlds. I convinced myself that what Xavier didn't know wasn't hurting him. He seemed happier than he'd been in years, probably because I was less resentful and more willing to participate in our relationship. Our intimacy improved because I was getting my emotional needs met elsewhere and could appreciate Xavier for what he was good at without resenting him for what he couldn't provide. Everything fell apart on a Tuesday afternoon when a process server showed up at my office with divorce papers. I was just getting back from lunch with Michael, where we'd been planning a weekend trip together, when this professional-looking woman asked if I was Ariana and handed me an envelope. I thought it was some kind of mistake at first, maybe something related to a patient at the clinic, but when I opened it up in front of half my colleagues, it was a complete divorce filing with my name on it. But it wasn't just divorce papers. Xavier had included printed copies of text messages between Michael and me going back 4 months, photos of us together at restaurants and hotels, receipts from places I'd claimed to be with friends, even GPS location data showing where I'd actually been during times I'd told Xavier I was somewhere else. He'd been documenting everything while I thought I was being so clever about hiding it all. The worst part was realizing how long Xavier had been playing this game. All those times I thought he was finally giving me space and learning to trust me, he was actually gathering evidence. When he stopped asking questions about my day, it was because he already knew where I'd been. When he encouraged me to spend time with friends, he was testing to see if I'd lie about my actual plans. When he started being more confident and less needy, it was because he was preparing to leave me. I drove home in complete shock, expecting to find Xavier there so we could talk about this like adults. But the house was empty. Not just empty like he was at work, empty like he'd moved out. His clothes were gone from our closet, his toiletries cleared out of the bathroom, even his coffee mug missing from the kitchen cabinet. It was like he'd never lived there at all. When I tried calling him, it went straight to voicemail, with a message saying all communication needed to go through his attorney. I checked our joint bank account and found that Xavier had withdrawn exactly half of everything, down to the penny. Our shared credit cards were canceled. The utilities were still on, but I got a notice that they'd been transferred entirely to my name. Xavier had systematically removed himself from every shared aspect of our life, while I was completely oblivious, thinking I was managing some sophisticated double life. The panic really set in when I tried calling Michael for support and got his voicemail too. When he finally called me back hours later, he was furious. Apparently, his girlfriend had received her own package of evidence, including photos of Michael and me together and copies of our most intimate text conversations. His life was imploding too, and instead of being supportive, he was blaming me for being careless and ruining everything for both of us. Michael said I should have been more careful about covering our tracks, that I should have known Xavier was suspicious, that I'd been reckless with both of our relationships. Then, he told me he couldn't see me anymore because he needed to focus on saving his own situation. And he hung up. Just like that, the person I'd been planning a future with cut me off completely when things got complicated. Over the next few days, I started getting calls from friends and family members who'd all received anonymous packages containing evidence of my affair. Xavier hadn't just prepared for the divorce. He'd prepared our entire social circle for this moment. Everyone already knew what had happened before I could explain my side or control the narrative in any way. The divorce went through faster than I thought possible. Xavier's evidence was so thorough that my lawyer basically said we should take whatever settlement he was offering and be grateful it wasn't worse. Within 6 months, everything was finalized, and I was living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment across town, trying to figure out how my entire life had fallen apart so quickly. Michael's situation didn't work out the way he'd hoped either. His girlfriend left him despite his attempts to minimize what had happened between us. But instead of that bringing us back together, he seemed to blame me for the whole mess. The few times I tried contacting him after everything settled down, he was cold and distant, like our entire relationship had been some kind of mistake he wanted to forget. I heard through mutual work connections that Michael had taken a job in another state and moved away completely. No forwarding address, no goodbye, nothing. The person I'd been planning a future with had disappeared from my life more completely than if he'd died. At least if someone dies, you get closure and people understand why you're grieving. When someone just decides they don't want you anymore, you're stuck processing the loss alone. Watching my social circle pick sides was almost as painful as losing Xavier and Michael. Most of our couple friends stayed loyal to Xavier, which I guess made sense since he'd been the one who always planned group activities and remembered birthdays. But I hadn't expected my own family to be so disappointed in me, or for people to act like Xavier was some kind of victim who deserved sympathy instead of the calculated manipulator who destroyed our marriage. The worst part was seeing how well Xavier was doing without me. Through social media and mutual friends, I found out he'd moved to a bigger city, started his own business, and seemed to be thriving in ways he never had during our marriage. He looked healthier, happier, more confident than I'd ever seen him. Photos showed him at networking events, traveling, doing all the spontaneous things I'd always wished he would do when we were together. About a year after our divorce was final, I heard he was seeing someone new. Not from him directly, obviously, since we hadn't spoken since the day I got served with papers, but through friends who were still in touch with both of us. Apparently, she was someone he'd met through his new business, and they seemed really compatible in ways that made everyone talk about how good they were together. I Facebook stalked her a few times, which I know was pathetic, but I needed to see what I was being replaced with. She seemed nice enough, but what really got to me was how Xavier acted around her in pictures. He looked relaxed and genuine, not like he was performing the role of perfect boyfriend, the way he'd always seemed to perform being the perfect husband with me. With her, he just looked like himself. It hit me that maybe Xavier hadn't been naturally suffocating and needy during our marriage. Maybe he'd been trying so hard to be perfect, because he could sense that I wasn't fully invested in our relationship. Maybe his constant need for reassurance had been his way of trying to figure out why I always seemed dissatisfied with everything he did. Maybe I'd trained him to be insecure by never being genuinely happy with his efforts. But then, I'd remember how boring and predictable our life together had been. How he'd never listened when I tried to tell him what I actually needed. How he'd turned romance into a scheduled maintenance program instead of something natural and spontaneous. I'd remember how alive I'd felt with Michael, how easy that relationship had been, how much more like myself I'd been when I was with someone who actually understood me. The problem was that Michael was gone, and he wasn't coming back. Xavier was gone too, and he was clearly better off without me. I was the only one who'd ended up alone, and I was the only one who seemed to be struggling to move on. Everyone else had figured out how to be happy without me, which made me wonder what was wrong with me that I couldn't figure out how to be happy without them. Dating was a disaster. The few guys I met seemed to lose interest once they got to know me better. Like there was something about my personality that was fine in small doses, but exhausting long-term. I'd catch myself comparing everyone to either Xavier or Michael, and no one ever measured up to what I'd had with either of them. 2 years later, I found out through mutual friends that Xavier and his new partner were getting married. They were having this big celebration that sounded like everything I'd always claimed I wanted, but had never actually planned with Xavier. Apparently, she was someone who appreciated his thoughtful nature and liked the way he planned special occasions. She thought his attention to detail was romantic instead of suffocating. The final blow came when I heard they were expecting their first child together. Xavier was going to be a father with someone who actually wanted to build a life with him, while I was still living alone in my one-bedroom apartment, working at the same job I'd had when we were married, with no prospects for anything better on the horizon. I realized that Xavier had gotten everything I'd always said I wanted: marriage to someone who appreciated him, a successful business, the confidence to be himself instead of constantly trying to please someone who couldn't be pleased. Meanwhile, I'd lost everything I'd actually had, and I'd never found anything to replace it with. The worst part was understanding that this was probably permanent. Xavier had moved on completely and was building a better life with someone better suited for him. Michael had disappeared and presumably found happiness elsewhere too. But I was stuck with the consequences of my choices, and there was no reset button that would let me go back and handle things differently. People kept telling me that I was still young, that I'd find someone else, that this was just a rough patch that would eventually lead to something better. But I could see in their faces that they didn't really believe it either. They were just saying what they thought they were supposed to say to someone whose life had completely fallen apart. The truth was that I'd had my chance at happiness with Xavier, and I'd thrown it away for something that turned out to be completely temporary. I'd had 8 years with someone who genuinely loved me, and wanted to build a life together. And I'd convinced myself that wasn't enough because it didn't feel exciting every single day. Now I knew what it felt like to have nothing, and it made me realize how much I'd actually lost. But even knowing all that, I couldn't bring myself to admit that the whole thing had been my fault. Xavier had been suffocating and predictable. Michael had been selfish and unreliable. Everyone else had been judgmental and unsupportive. I'd made some questionable choices. Sure, but I wasn't the only one who'd contributed to how everything turned out. If Xavier had been a better husband, more exciting, more understanding, more willing to give me the space I needed, none of this would have happened. If Michael had been honest about what he wanted, instead of disappearing when things got complicated, we could have worked through the problems together. If our friends and family had been more supportive instead of immediately taking sides, maybe I could have recovered from this setback and moved on with my life. Instead, I was stuck dealing with the consequences of everyone else's failures while they all got to move on and be happy. Xavier got his perfect new wife and his successful business and his baby on the way. Michael got his fresh start in a new city where no one knew about his mistakes. Everyone else got to feel superior by judging my choices while pretending their own relationships were so much better and more honest. I was the only one left holding the bag, the only one who had to live with the aftermath of what everyone else had done wrong. And maybe that wasn't fair, but it was reality, and there wasn't anything I could do to change it now. All I could do was try to accept that some people get second chances, and some people don't. And apparently, I was in the second category. The hardest part was accepting that this was probably it for me. This apartment, this job, this loneliness. This was likely what the rest of my life was going to look like. Xavier would keep getting happier and more successful with his new family. Michael would keep building whatever new life he'd found somewhere else. And I'd keep existing in the wreckage of what used to be my life, with no real hope that anything was going to get significantly better. Sometimes I wondered if I should have handled things differently, if there was some other way I could have gotten what I needed without losing everything I had. But then I'd remember how trapped and suffocated I'd felt in my marriage, how alive and understood I'd felt with Michael, and I'd think that at least I'd experienced something real, even if it didn't last. That had to count for something, even if no one else understood it. Even if I was the only one who remembered how good it had felt to be genuinely excited about someone, to have conversations that mattered, to feel like someone saw me as more than just a wife who should be grateful for whatever attention she got. Even if the price for those few months of feeling alive had been losing everything else, maybe it had still been worth it, because the alternative would have been staying married to Xavier forever, having the same conversations and the same date nights and the same predictable routine year after year until I died of boredom. Maybe this loneliness was better than that kind of slow suffocation. Maybe being alone was better than being with someone who loved an idea of me more than the actual me. At least now I knew what I was capable of feeling for someone, what kind of connection was actually possible between two people who understood each other. Even if I never found that again, I'd had it once, and that was more than a lot of people could say. Xavier certainly never inspired that kind of passion in me, and his new wife probably didn't even know what she was missing because she'd never experienced anything better. So, maybe I hadn't lost everything. Maybe I'd gained something too. The knowledge that I was capable of more than just going through the motions of a relationship. Maybe someday I'd find someone else who could appreciate that about me. Someone who wouldn't disappear when things got complicated or try to control every aspect of our life together. Or maybe I wouldn't, and this would be it. But either way, I'd tried to find something real instead of just accepting what everyone else thought I should be satisfied with. And if that made me the villain in everyone else's story, then so be it. At least I'd been honest about what I wanted, even if I hadn't been honest about how I went about getting it.